Hey, if this is your first Sunday, welcome. We are so glad that you are here today. I don't normally preach in a hoodie, but I forgot to bring a button down, so we're going to go with the hoodie today. But as it turns out, it's cold enough that the hoodie was probably a good choice. So if I wouldn't have said anything, you'd have been like, man, he's really smart. But now I blew that. You guys, if you know me at all, you know that I'm not smart. Hey, if you have your Bibles and you want to follow along, whether it be a physical Bible or a digital Bible, I would invite you to turn to Mark chapter 5. And as you're doing that, I feel impressed. Like I need to just share one thing with you. Last week, I typically don't read from a physical Bible. I read from a digital Bible. Part of the reason why is just my eyes are really bad, and it's hard to see up here with all of the lights shining and everything like that. And so last week, I came up, and when I came up here, I had my iPad that I preach from. I had my sermon notes to make sure that I don't miss anything, and then I had my small travel Bible. And in a moment of trying to clear space and get kind of to where I normally am, you may remember this, you may not remember, it may not be a big deal, but I turned and I tossed the Word of God onto the ground behind me. And I know, man, as your pastor, I want to apologize for that. If you saw that as a sign of disrespect, I did not intend it that way at all. I was simply just trying to set it down out of the way, but I turned and kind of callously tossed it on the ground, and so I apologize for that. I felt convicted about that the moment that I did it, and I've struggled with it all week. And so if that's for you, then it's for you. If it's only for me and God, then I felt like I needed to do it publicly since I did it publicly. So Mark chapter 5. Have you ever guys had a moment when things went from bad to worse? Cooper, can you turn me down just a little bit? Have you ever had a moment when things went from bad to worse? Yeah, I see Vinny's like shaking his head yes. So that happened for us this last week. Now we're clean and clear except for Harper, but she's at home with Becky today. But so last week Josie didn't come to church because she had a little bit of a rash, and so here in the Middleton School District, I don't know if you know this, but hand, foot, and mouth is going around right now, and so it's kind of happening. And so out of an abundance of caution, we kept Josie home from church last week. And then wouldn't you know it, she woke up on Monday morning and she had the full on the bumps and on her hands and her feet, and the poor girl was itching, and it moved to her scalp. And so we're like, oh man, this is horrible, it's miserable. And so she stayed home, and Monday and Tuesday happened, and then I'm driving to go to an appointment on Wednesday. Actually, I had to leave to go do something, and my appointment was waiting for me at the Grace House. We were actually in the same office, and I had to drive away, and as I'm pulling out of the parking lot, I get a call from the school, hey, you need to come pick up Harper. She's not feeling well. So then I go pick up Harper. We bring her home, and I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, it's not, I don't think it's hand, foot, and mouth, but it's something. You need to take her to the doctor. And so we took her to the doctor on Friday, and they tested her for strep. Oh, man, right? From bad to worse, it's just one thing after another. I'm sure if you have kids, you can identify with that, right? It just moves from bad to worse. And as we get ready to pick up our reading, that's what's fixing to happen with Jesus and the disciples. So at the end of Mark chapter 4, what's happening is the disciples and Jesus are crossing the sea, this body of water, and this violent storm arises, and almost to the point of death. And Jesus stills the water. He makes the wind and the waves stop, and they make it safely to the other side. And so that's the end of chapter 4. And I don't know if you've ever been in a boat on like a big water, but if you're anything like me, I don't like deep water. I'm not going to get into why I don't like deep water, but just to suffice it to say, when I was a sophomore in high school, I was in the middle of Lake Travis in Austin, Texas, and I got hit by a boat, which required about 400 staples, and they quit counting at something like 1,000 stitches to close all the wounds. It took about an hour and 15 minutes to get from where we were at in the middle of the lake to the dock, to get into a car, to then drive to the hospital. So you can imagine, I don't like deep water. It's an issue for me. And so I get where the disciples and I get where Jesus are at, right? They're in the middle of this big body of water. The storm comes up, waves are crashing. The disciples think they're going to die. They don't realize yet, or they should, but they still lack faith that Jesus is in the boat, so everything is going to be okay. He calms the storm, and he asks the disciples, do you still lack faith? And we pick up our reading in Mark chapter 5, verse 1, and we're going to read 4 or 5 verses, and then we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to read some more, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to work our way through this story, okay? Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. It said, "Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of Gerasa, and Jesus stepped out of the boat." So this big wave storm and all this stuff happens, and they get to the other side, and Jesus steps out of the boat, and immediately there met him out of the tomb, so it's a graveyard, a man with an unclean spirit. He had lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. And so Mark is setting us up. He's giving us some background, which we'll look at in a little bit. Verse 4, "For he'd often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones." You've got the picture, right? Everybody sees what's going on here. This massive storm, they get out. I mean, I can imagine the disciples, right? Hands on knees. Maybe they're motion sickness, or they're just thankful to be alive. They're falling on the ground. I just imagine like the 12 guys, right? Like diving out on the ground, and they're kissing the ground. They're like, "Oh, thank you, Jesus." But literally, it's thank you, Jesus, because he's standing right there. I thought that would have got a laugh or two at least. And man, they're just like, can you just imagine it? They're on their knees and they're panting, and Jesus steps out, and this crazy, demon-possessed man comes rushing at them. I can only imagine, right, the disciples stumbling back in the water. I don't like scary. Anybody here like scary movies? I don't like scary movies. They bother me. Life is scary enough. I don't need to watch a movie that scares me. I was watching a TV show on Prime, and it wasn't scary, but it made you think. It was more psychological than jump out, boo, scare you. And I realized I needed to stop watching it because I was watching one of the episodes, and I looked down, and my heart rate was like 143 beats a minute. And I was like, man, I got to stop watching. So I turned it off, and I haven't finished it. But I don't like scary movies, right? Because there's always these twists and turns. And so I imagine that, like, if movies existed back then, the disciples wouldn't be a fan of it because of what they're going through in this moment. But what we have to understand is as we look at this, and this is your first point in this series, Let It Be Known, and it may feel a little weird because this is a Thanksgiving series talking about proclaiming the good news of Jesus, but we're starting this message specifically, and we're going to address what this man is going through. And if we're going to address it, we have to understand this, that demonic power is real and destructive. Demonic power is real and it's destructive. In this day and age, it's easy to assume that there's no such thing as demons. I personally have never dealt with anybody that's been demon-possessed. In my 6 or 7 years of ministry, I've never dealt with anybody that's been demon-possessed, specifically one-on-one. I have walked into situations that I felt, and you could feel the oppression. You could feel the evil settling in on a place. And the best example I can remember is a couple of years ago when I went to Kenya. And Keith and I were driving through, and we were visiting all of these schools, and we were walking through the slums. And the slums didn't feel evil. They just felt down. Right? I mean, there's raw sewage running on the ground and people living in abject poverty and all of those things. But we drove to this place called Casino, this town called Casino. And as a church, we've built this school called Coram Deo. The presence of God is what Coram Deo means, in this town called Casino. And Casino in Kenya is the worst of the worst. And so we're driving through, and on more than any other day, we have more people with us. And I would say like security, like bodyguards. There's just more people than normally in other places that we've gone. And you know, we were driving through, and it looked like every other place that we'd been to in Kenya. But when we opened the doors and we stepped out, the oppression was real. You could feel the oppression weighing down on you. And so while it might be easy in Western America today say that there's no such thing as demons, demons exist. Their power is real, and it's destructive. And I'm noticing, is that really hard to see on the screen? Can you guys read that, or is it just me? Is it really hard to read? Girl, you can do it? Okay. I'll repeat it a couple of times if we need to. And not only is it that the assumption here, but it's the assumption to believe that back then, maybe they were just naive, like they didn't understand like the difference between maybe like a psychological issue and demon possession. And that's just not the case, because we read in Matthew 4:24, and you can just write that down, you don't have to turn to it, but we read that the news about Jesus is spreading, and the people brought to him the ill, the demon-possessed, the epileptics, the paralyzed, and he healed them all. Now, what's interesting is the Greek word for epileptics. They're literally, it's translated, it's this idea of people that have seizures or irrational behaviors. And so they understood that there's a difference between a mental issue like depression or anxiety that millions of people suffer with. That. As your pastor standing on the stage, I'm one of those people that struggle with that. Thank God the last couple of weeks, the last month and a half, I've had good Sunday mornings, but there are Sunday mornings where I don't exist on the front row because I'm in the back having a panic attack. Like I got to get up and I got to get up and talk like I can't do that right now. And so those things are real, and there are issues, and people need to go to doctors, and there are medicine that help with those. But the reality is that demon possession exists, and its power is destructive, and it's real. The Bible recognizes that. We recognize that today. There's a difference between having mental health issues and being possessed or being just physically sick and ill. And part of the danger of the society that we live in, and I don't just want to bash society that we live in, but we have a tendency as a society to celebrate the evil. Anybody familiar? And listen, I don't know if anybody does this, so I'm not preaching at anybody specific. Anybody ever hear about the show Dahmer on Netflix? So it released. I've got some dates here, and these are old numbers. So anybody know who Jeffrey Dahmer is, right? He's a serial killer. Like if there's anybody possessed, I mean, it's that dude. Netflix just did a documentary on him, and they put it out there. These numbers are from October the 4th. And actually in 4 days from when it released to the numbers, it catapulted and became the 9th most watched TV series on Netflix in history in 4 days. In 4 days, it streamed 496 million hours of watch time in 4 days. Like, how's that possible? There's not that many hours. Listen, the way that they count that, if we all sit down and we all watch an episode for an hour, then however 150 people in here, that counts, right? And so you can see how it multiplies over the earth. We celebrate this character, and you know, like we couch in like, oh, I'm just learning, like I just it's interesting, or I read the books about it, and I just want to know and all that kind of stuff. But why even deal with it? Why even bring it into your life? Why even watch it? Because I'm guilty of this. I've started watching TV shows in series that we've gotten an episode or two in, and we've had to stop watching. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be like Evil with Dahmer. We did this once, and I think I've shared this story before, but Becky and I several years ago, when the kids were little, and before even some of them existed, we used to watch Friday Night Lights, the football series based in Texas. And I loved that show in part because part of it's based on the high school that I went to in Texas. And so we would watch it. Becky and I would watch it. And so Cooper and Savannah were a couple of years ago that we felt like, hey, they're old enough. Let's start watching it with them. And this would be really cool. And we'll kind of bond over it. And we found that like every episode we were fast forwarding, or we were telling, hey, Cooper, look away, or hey, Savannah, mute the TV. And it was happening for like 4 or 5 or 6 minutes every episode. And we did this for like 3 or 4 episodes, and then finally, and thanks be to God, because in this moment, I even thinking about it, so I kind of abdicated my role as a spiritual leader of our family. But Becky looked at me and she goes, what are we doing? Every episode, we continue to have to fast forward, or we have to skip, or we have to go, we can't watch the rest of this episode because of what it showed. What are we teaching our kids? What are we introducing into their life and into their spirit? And so we recognize that, and so we just had to stop. We just quit doing it. And so we recognize that demonic power is real and it's destructive. And let's keep reading in Mark chapter 5. Let's pick it up in verse 6, okay? And when he saw Jesus from afar, right, this is the demon-possessed man. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And then we're going to read this interesting, this interaction between Jesus and this demon-possessed man. And it says, and crying out in a loud voice, he said, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And so Jesus, seeing this demon-possessed man rushing at him, immediately begins to cast the demon out. And so then the demon's talking with Jesus here. And he's saying, "Why are you tormenting me?" And Jesus asked him in verse 9, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. And what we can learn from those 4 verses is this, that demons are scared to death of Jesus. Can you get an amen? Demons are a scary thing, but you know what? We serve a God, and we serve Jesus, and they're scared of Jesus. And what you have to understand is what's happening here. See, the demons understand theology. Demons understand the timeline of what's supposed to happen. At some point, at a future point in history, we don't know, demons are going to be judged, and they're going to be sent to the lake of fire by Jesus. They're going to be cast into the lake of fire for eternity, and they know that that's their future that's waiting for them. But they also know that it happens at the second coming of Jesus, not the first coming of Jesus. And so this demon-possessed man, this legion, it's hundreds, maybe thousands of demons that are possessing this man, come rushing at Jesus, and he said, "Why are you tormenting us? It's not time yet. You don't get to send us to the lake of fire till the second coming, not the first coming." And they begin to plead with Jesus. They're trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to figure out, why are you here? They understand eschatology. They understand the timeline. They understand what the prophets in the Old Testament has said about what's going to happen. It's not the first coming. It's the second coming of Jesus. It's not our time yet. Some estimates, Roman legion in this area, it's where a bulk of the army would have been based. And in some estimates, put as many as 6,000 men in a legion. And so we go from a number of demons to possibly as many as 6,000. It doesn't tell us here exactly. It just tells us that there was a whole bunch. But the story doesn't end there. It keeps going. Let's pick it up in verse 11 through 15. And now a great herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside. So we've got a couple of things here. Just put a pin, just put your finger on that period at the end of that verse. We've got a couple of things happening in this specific place that's important to understand about the Jewish tradition and Jewish law. So there are tombs, which makes it unclean, right there. So Jesus is interacting with this demon-possessed man, and the disciples are there, and he comes rushing out. He is ceremonially, yes, I got it, unclean. Possibly, not possibly, he is also physically unclean, because we're going to read later, it describes him after he has this interaction with Jesus, but that's going to clue us in that he's standing in front of Jesus naked right now in this moment. He's cutting himself with rocks, so you can imagine what that looks like back in that day, living in a tomb. Cooper cut his finger the other day, and he forgot to put Neosporin on it, and he woke up this morning, and he's like, man, this little paper cut, it's all swollen and stretched, and it's got not to gross you out, but there's some pus in it, right? And that's just from a little paper cut, and paper typically is clean. This guy's cutting himself with rocks, he's breaking chains, and so not only is he unclean ceremonially, but he's physically unclean. Hair is probably matted, you can imagine sticks and rocks and all that kind of stuff. And then we see in verse 11 that there's a giant herd of pigs around, which also, according to Jewish law in the Old Testament, also make this unclean. Jews didn't mess with pork. They don't eat pork. It makes them unclean, and so then they can't go into the temple. And so we have this trifecta of things happening that make this guy a person that nobody would deal with. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with him. Just by touching him, you were unclean immediately. We pick it up in verse 12. And they begged him, this is the legion, these are the demons, saying, send us to the pigs and let us enter them. Now, 12 and 13, we don't understand why Jesus did this. In verse 13, it says, "So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down a steep bank into the sea and drowned. The herdsmen," verse 14, these people are standing around watching what's happening. "They fled, and they told it in the city and the countryside, and the people came to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus, and they saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region." And what we can learn from this is while demonic power is real and it's destructive, the demons are afraid of Jesus. Jesus can completely deliver sinners. Jesus can completely deliver sinners. Let's read that description again. In verse 15, "So the people and the herdsmen come rushing back from the city, and they came to Jesus, and they saw the demon-possessed man." He's not demon-possessed anymore, but he was. "The one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid." You know, one of my favorite things to do, and I say this cautiously because you can't invent things, but one of my favorite things to do is just to think about things that the Bible doesn't describe that happened. So, right, we have this interaction. Jesus, the disciples that come in, the demons in this man, they're yelling at Jesus. He casts them out. The herdsmen leave. They go tell the city. And there's some space of time between when they leave and the people in the city come rushing back, and it's just Jesus, the 12 disciples, and this guy that he just healed. Can you imagine what that conversation must have been like? Just imagine with me, just for a moment, the last time that you had a head cold and you couldn't breathe through both nostrils at the same time. Dude, and man, listen, it's worse for guys. Like, it's 1,000,000 times worse, head colds for guys. It's like giving birth to 5 kids at once. For us, when we're sick, we have a head cold. Like, right, we've got Dimetapp, we've got Robitussin, we've got NyQuil, Dayquil, and NyQuil. Right? We've got stuff we're taking to just dry up the congestion. We're taking any and everything just so we can go and breathe through both our nostrils. It's really bad if you wear contacts, right? And like your eyes are puffy and they're itchy and they're red. You can't put your eye contacts in and you're half blind. You can't find your glasses. And that first breath, when you finally wake up on that morning after the illness has finally dissipated and it's run its course, and you're able to set up and you're like, something's different about this morning. What's different about this morning than yesterday morning? You realize, I can breathe through both of my nostrils. Thank you, Jesus. Which is actually kind of cool, because when we say it, and the disciples said it, and I made the joke about him standing right there, when we say it, he's right there. He's not some far off God. He's a live inside you kind of God. How grateful are we when we can take that breath and we can just go, oh man, that's so good. Can you imagine the conversation that man had with Jesus after everybody else left? And it's just Jesus, the 12 disciples, and him. Can you imagine what he said? Man, I hope that one day in heaven I have the opportunity to talk to this man. What did Jesus say to you? What was that conversation like? Man, I sure would love to know that. Let's keep reading. There's more, man. I'm getting fired up. I'm so excited. And Jesus, verse 16, we're gonna. And they said to those who described and see what happened, the demon-possessed man and the pigs. 17, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from the region. Now they weren't begging because they were upset that they lost a bunch of money in the pigs. They're worried about money, and here they have the creator of the universe standing in front of them that's able to cast out the demons from a man that nobody could bind with chains before. Jesus completely heals this guy. He's clothed. I mean, like, where did the clothes come from? Maybe Jesus just said, let there be clothes, and there were clothes. We don't know. It doesn't say. I imagine maybe they had some, and they're like, hey, Matthew, give us your extra tunic. And Matthew's like, come on, it's the only one I've got. Like, this dude needs clothes. So they dress him. In verse 18 is, and as he was getting into the boat, now listen to look at the flip, look at the juxtaposition from the beginning of the chapter to verse 18. It's really cool. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with the demons begged that he might go with him. So we have the demons begging Jesus, why are you tormenting us? Don't make us leave. And then here we close the chat. We close this story with the man begging that he might be with him. But Jesus did not permit him, and he said, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Here's the great thing, church, for this guy and for you and I. Jesus commissions the unqualified and the disqualified. The first preacher wasn't Matthew or Mark or Peter or John. This was the first preacher. This demon-possessed guy that had this legion of demons in him, naked, living unclean in a cemetery surrounded by pigs, is the first preacher that Jesus sends out to tell the good news. He did not permit him, but he said, go home, tell your friends, and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. You're like, wait a second. Well, do we know the rest of the story? We do, actually. We know the rest of the story. We know what happens with this guy. In verse 20, he went away and he began to proclaim in the Decapolis, and all that means is that this is an area where there are 10 cities. It's kind of a built-up, thriving metropolis, but there's 10 of them, so they call it Decapolis, and so there's 10. It's pretty, self-explanatory. And he began to tell how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. In the rest of the story, the rest of his story, the result of his preaching and him telling his neighbors and his friends and his family and everybody in the city that would listen, the good news is in Mark 7:31. Just a couple of chapters down the road, Jesus is coming back. The only time he's ever been to this area is when he had this interaction, and they begin to bring out the deaf and the lame to Jesus that he might heal them. And so the result of this guy's testimony is they know now Jesus has the power to heal the sick and completely heal the sinner. And as the band comes up on stage to lead us in our last song, here's the thing that I want you to remember. Here's the thing that I want you to take away. If there's anything that you take away from right now, it's this. It's that your story is God's glory. It's that your story is God's glory. It doesn't matter what your story is. You were made and created and saved for God's glory. In 1 Peter, we read this, that you're a chosen generation. Did you know that? That you're a part of a chosen generation, that you're a royal priesthood, and the purpose of your salvation and the fact that you've been chosen is so that you can tell about the excellent glories of Him who saved you from darkness into His light. The first preacher wasn't a guy that went to seminary or that had years of experience in sharing the gospel of Jesus. He was just a guy that was possessed by a bunch of demons that Jesus completely healed and sent on a mission. So if you've had an interaction with Jesus, if you have a story, guess what? You have the ability, you have the responsibility to go share it with somebody else. It doesn't have to be on a stage on a Sunday morning. It could be in the grocery store, or it could be in preparing a meal for a sick neighbor. It could be a note card written and sent to a friend that you know is going through a tough time. Maybe God's blessed you financially and you know somebody that needs help, and you're like, you know what, I can help that person. Or we're going to talk about that coming up here at Christmas in a couple of weeks. We're going to have an opportunity to partner and bless some families. And it might be the way that they hear about Jesus. Because your story is God's glory. You can't hold it into yourself. You have to share with people about what Jesus has done for you. So I'm going to invite you to stand and sing with the band as you think about that.